Hello, this video will cover building an argument essay. So it's just a closer look at the introduction, body, and conclusion paragraphs of a standard argument essay. The introduction paragraphs, we have some ideas for some strong beginnings. For key elements, you want to make sure that your introduction paragraph has a hook to catch your reader's attention. You could consider something like a quotation or a question, grabs the reader's attention right away. This essay will be just a little bit longer than some of our other essays, and so you can spend a little bit more time on this paragraph. You definitely can fill out a good 5 to 7 sentence paragraph for your introduction. The second thing you need to include is relevant background information. This might include clarification or definition. The main thing is to focus on controversy. Why is this topic controversial? Making sure that we understand what the multiple sides are of this argument so that we can narrow down to your thesis, which is your claim on the issue. Remember, this is not a pro-con essay, and it is not an essay where you are allowing the reader to make up their mind about the topic. You are stating a claim on the issue, so you do need to take a side with this argument. Some ideas for starting the introduction paragraph might be a memorable quotation. A lot of times students will look up quotes about a certain topic, and you're more than welcome to use those quote websites. Just keep in mind that you want to make sure that the quote that they have is attributed to the right person. You also might look for quotes in the sources that you're using. You might use a startling fact or statistic. These are really very effective at the beginning of an argument essay, just because it gets the reader to think about the topic in a different way. And statistics work really well as well for kind of showing us some factual data right at the beginning. You could also start with an anecdote or narrative. This might be a story that you described a scenario kind of thing, or it might be a story that you found in like a newspaper article or something, so that it's an actual story of an actual person that you might attribute to a source. You could ask a question. Rhetorical questions work as well. However, make sure that it is a question that can be answered within the essay, and also a question that's not, you don't want to ask a string of questions, first of all, so a single question, and you might want to avoid second person for reasons that we've discussed in class. You might use a vivid example or image. This is kind of the same as or similar to doing an anecdote or narrative, like a story about a person. You might also describe a scenario where people are involved. You could describe a scene or something like that to give the reader more of that pathos at the beginning. You could also propose a problem, contradiction, or dilemma. Anything that gets the reader to think about the topic maybe in a different way than they might have before would be a good idea. You could provide some historical background as well. So looking at the history of this particular topic, if it's relevant, and kind of thinking about how does that lead up to your thesis, which would presumably be a current type of argument. So here's just some examples using the vivid image, which would be describing a scenario of the young driver who wraps his car around a tree. Quotation from John F. Kennedy: if it's a famous person, you don't even need to put them on your works cited page because we should be able to find the quotation in that person pretty easily, and a lot of that is considered common knowledge. But if you get a quote out of one of your sources, you'll definitely want to put your source in there. You can ask a question. Here's a good example would be, is it morally acceptable to change the basic nature of a human being by using science or nature, or science or medicine? And so that would be a good way to get the reader to think about the topic differently. And then here's just an example of the use of a statistic. Things not to do in your introduction: apologize. You're not an expert. Obviously, you're a student writer, but you don't want to suggest that you haven't actually done the work. Announce your intentions. Avoid announcements just in general. In this paper, I will cover the next topic we're going to cover. It's not a speech. You don't want your paper to be self-aware, but you also don't want to lead your reader through like you would in a speech. And then obviously you don't want to waste time either. You want to get into the main part of the essay. You want a good sized introduction paragraph, but you also don't want a really, really long one. So keep your introductory hook fairly short. For body paragraphs, you want to make sure that you're creating paragraphs with purpose, so each paragraph appears to be in the essay for a reason. If you want, you can use what's called a formula for your paragraph, which involves a specific number of sentences in a specific order. Some students find this helpful, and some students can't write like this, and so it's up to you whether or not this is useful. Topic and bridge sentence would be first, so that first sentence of every paragraph would be a topic sentence that introduces us to the main idea. Then you would introduce your source or evidence, or perhaps clarify the topic. Then you would introduce the first piece of evidence for that paragraph, usually in the form of a quote or a paraphrase. You would explain it, you would transition, and then you have your second piece of evidence, also in the form of a quote or paraphrase. This allows also for the use of like one quote and one paraphrase within a paragraph, and so it can be a good guide to follow. And then, of course, the last sentence, rather than moving on to the next topic, because we don't transition at the end, we transition at the beginning, you would explain the connection between the two references, and then, of course, tie back to either the thesis of the entire essay, or so the main argument that you're trying to make, or the topic within that paragraph. So that last sentence will provide a conclusion. So if you follow this formula, a couple of things to remember. First of all, topic sentence at the beginning, so you make sure that you're not just starting with a quote or something like that. Two pieces of evidence for each main point, and then lots of explanation and connection in between, so they're not back to back. You have several sentences in there and helping to connect them together. Those are the sentences that most students are missing. It also, if you follow the formula, you get at least 7 sentences, which is a good fully developed paragraph. Also thinking about transitions, I already talked about bridge sentences, making sure that you introduce the main point and discuss as well as the purpose of that point. So how does it tie to the thesis? A lot of students will say the first reason why medical marijuana should be legalized or something like that, so that we have a strong bridge. So you can number your reasons as well. You also want to make sure that that sentence is more general than the other information in the paragraph. So we start off a little bit more broad and narrow down to your specific evidence. Obviously, you want to tie in what you just discussed to the new information. So thinking about the previous paragraph, what was your main point there? How does it relate to the main point here? And so you can do a little bit of comparison with that bridge sentence as well. And then counter arguments, we need to make sure that those are presented as opposing viewpoints. So it's not presented as equal to your side. You want to make sure that that transition is something like people who oppose this idea will argue, or something like that, so that we have that direct contrast between them. So these are paragraph level transitions. This would be transitions at the very beginning of each paragraph. You also want to make sure that your refutation transitions back to your viewpoint, so that we don't get confused about what viewpoint we're at in the paper. So that's paragraph level transitions. Obviously, sentence level transitions are then those transition words and phrases between sentences that is part of writing as well. The conclusion of your essay, you want to make sure that you're spending some time on it as well. Brief summary of your essay's purpose, rewriting the thesis. Do not copy and paste the thesis from the introduction. It should include a short summary of your main points, the importance of the overall argument, thinking about how can you address the whole essay in general. Now that the reader has had a chance to read through your full argument, how can you go back to it with a new understanding? You want to also have a good concluding statement, so that final sentence of your essay needs to end strongly. Especially in an argument, there are a lot of things that you could do. You could do a call to action, which asks the reader to take an action. You can tie it to a larger issue, kind of think about outside of this particular issue, is there anything else that it affects? You can revisit the hook in the introduction, so that makes a nice sort of rounded way of looking back at something. You don't need to copy and paste the hook, but if you did like a quote or a story or something at the beginning, we could revisit it. You can also include a final piece of evidence. A lot of students like this option. They just find another quote, fact, or statistic, just like they did for the introduction. And if none of those work, then giving it a sense of closure is always an option. So feeling like we have ended everything as opposed to just dropping off a cliff at the end. So those are just some ideas for you for completing the introduction, body, and conclusion of an argument essay, and working on some of the things that we have covered.